Merkel Media.
I'm exhausted, looking for everything in the shadows. Start looking at people like they don't matter. I'm waking up to the fact, more than a little bit shallow. I'm lost in this hole, but I don't wanna. I'm lost in this hole, 'cause I'm just trying to
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Free the Rabbits, and I have a very interesting guest. Fringe is in the building, and she's done a couple of podcasts with my very good friend, Tony Merkel. And just so you guys know, maybe early on, she might be a fish out of water here, because I kind of hit her upside the head about a month ago with this idea. And she's like, I don't know if I'm necessarily going to be good for this. I'm like, no, you're going to be perfect because you have so much experience in this abduction arena. And what I've been studying, I found some very fascinating parallels between what came out in the 60s, these Indigo Children, these supposed hybrids that came out around that time. And then it leads all the way into a lot of stuff you've talked about, Fringe, with MiLabs and alien abduction, and some of these connections to Gate, which I think is important too, because a lot of that has been rebranded over the past 10 years where, you know, maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it was being looked at as a little more paranormal, and now it's being shifted into more of tech and more technocracy at this point. So I think they're moving it into a different realm and kind of shifting people's paradigm in a sense to where they're going to accept it more as like a scientific thing and take the spiritual out of it. However, I think there's a huge spiritual component to it. But if you can, for anybody that's listening to my podcast that doesn't know who you are, let them know who you are. And then we'll kind of jump into this whole weird idea of Indigo Children and MiLabs.
Well, thanks, Joe. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Yes, this might not be my go-to topic, but I'll be all right. So I go by Fringe. I still don't have my identity out there just because, you know, it can get kind of weird when we're talking about this kind of topics. There can be some weird stuff happening. You know, people like to dox and stuff like that. So I just keep it at Fringe. I like to start out by saying that I'm just a regular person. I'm 56 years old now. I've been married for 27 years to the same man. I did almost 20 years in a career in law enforcement, so I have that background. My husband did 30 years. Let's see, I'm not under the care of a psychiatrist. I'm just a grandmother. I don't do any drugs, don't do any alcohol. But at the same time, even though I'm just a regular person, I do deal with this alien abduction phenomenon. It seems to be generational. It runs in my family. And I like to get out there and just talk about it because there's a lot of people dealing with this and they're not able to come forward. They're not able to talk about it. A lot of people can't even talk about it with their own spouses or their own family. So I just like to get out there and talk about it. And all I really ask is for people to keep an open mind and, you know, just kind of wonder, could this actually be real? Could there be something to this? So that's a little bit of my background.
Yeah, I find it interesting you were in law enforcement for almost 20 years. My sister is still in law enforcement. She's been in it for going on 16 years now, and she was deep undercover for a long time too. So she worked with SLED, which is one of the premier narcotics divisions in South Carolina. She traveled all over South Carolina, and she's played everything from prostitutes to drug dealers to anything in between. So she's been a part of so many different interesting stories that she's told me. But now she's a lieutenant and she runs the department and runs SWAT. She used to be the first one in on SWAT too, which was pretty wild. You know, she weighs like a buck 25, and then she's running in out the gate on SWAT teams, and she still does from time to time. She just enjoys it. She's an adrenaline junkie. So that's one of her
there's a little
things.
parallel though. That's exactly what I was doing.
Wow.
I mean, I'd say I did about 5 years in patrol, and then I spent the rest of my time doing exactly what you just talked about. So, yeah.
That's super cool. Yeah. When I talk to her about some of this stuff, and she's super smart, even though she downplays it and acts like I'm the smart one of the family. She's like, you're the one that did well in school and college and all these things. I'm like, yeah, you're the one taking down the black mafia, which she actually did in South Carolina. So
Yeah. That sounds very, very similar to the things I did. And you know what? It gives us a lot of common sense, right? There's something to having a degree and being smart and, going to college and all these things, which some law enforcement do, especially if your sister's a lieutenant, she might be in that category. But there's also something to be said for just having common sense and street smarts and developing that, sixth sense that we kind of need to be out there and to be safe. So I go up against a lot of people who are not able to know anything. They can't make any conclusions, unless there's some weird scientific evidence out there. So yeah, same background. Interesting.
yeah, it's funny. There was a point in time in my life where, and this is before I came back to God, and I was literally running the streets, where I was super involved in the occult and all kind of other things. Plus, I was hanging out with a bunch of drug dealers and all that. So there was a point in time where my sister and I were literally in the opposite sides of the law, different states though, so it never overlapped or anything. But we used to laugh about that. Well, we laugh about it now that we were both on the opposite ends of the spectrum. So I saw one end of it, she saw the other. And it's funny now when we hang out and we can talk about some of that stuff. She always jokes because she flips a lot of informants, and that's kind of her big deal. And she always tells them, she's like, there's only one person I know that never flipped, and that's my brother. And yeah, he paid for it. So,
Somebody's paying, right? Somebody's paying.
Yes. Well, I just remember my dad telling me, because my dad's a pastor and he still is. He's 75 now. And I remember the first time I got in trouble, he told me to never snitch. He's like, own up to what you did and be a man. So I did, and never took the easy way out on that. So my sister is proud of that. And I'm not proud of being in trouble though. So there's that. So, and that was ages ago. I feel like an eon ago at this point. But yeah, we both have interesting backgrounds, and she's kind of looking to eventually get out at some point too, just from a physical standpoint. I think she's kind of ready, and it's definitely taxing, especially when you're running a department and you're dealing with, not only all of these different informants, all these different cases and lawyers, you're also dealing with a group of people underneath you too. So I think she's done a lot. So I think at some point then she'll definitely step away and kind of take it easy on that pension.
That's where I'm at right now. It's a great place to be. Every day is Saturday.
Right. Well, I'm sure it gives you a lot more time to research a lot of the things that have happened to you as well, and being able to really dig into things that, I've listened to a lot of your story, and this stuff's been happening to you for a long time, and while you were a police officer too, from what I gathered. So I'm sure that going through that during those times was extra difficult too, because you're dealing with, this whole career plus whatever else is happening when it comes to entities and all these abduction scenarios. I'm sure that can be very taxing and tolling on the mind and body.
Yeah, it was. So back then when I was working, I was dealing with a lot of shadow people is what I've I didn't know that term at the time, but yeah, just a lot of shadow people and that kind of thing. And I never put the whole thing together that, I'm dealing with a shadow person. I'm flying out the window to some bright lights in the backyard. I'm not thinking aliens. I'm thinking supernatural, paranormal,
Mm.
shadow people, demons is really where I was at for most of my life. So it was super interesting to actually, wake up and realize that it's all related. It's all, the same thing.
And to that point of shadow people and entities, I've got a little story that I wanted to tell you on this podcast and just see what you think about it from your perspective going through a lot of this, because I've had a ton of paranormal stuff happen in my life too. And some of it, especially when I was involved in the occult, I was actively trying to bring about. So that's why I try to tell people a lot of times that I understand more than they do about what some of this stuff is, because of my fascination with people like Aleister Crowley and Jack Parsons and these guys who were actively connecting to these entities, and they had rituals to do so. And I've definitely seen my share before, but also as I came back to Christ and even up until now, I definitely have paranormal things happen, things that happen in the dreamscape that don't really feel like they're in the dreamscape. And one of those things happened recently. Hey guys, before we get back into the show, I just want to let people know who have been asking how they can donate to the show to help with the show's growth. You can become a member here on YouTube. There are 3 different tiers. There is Nephilim Portal Babies, there is Nephilim Hunter, and Good Nephilim. Each one of them have a few different things that come along with them, but the one thing that comes with all of them is custom emojis that you can use in the live chats and in the comments below. I really appreciate all the love you guys have been showing. And listen, if you can't become a member, just you donating your time is one of the best gifts that you can give this channel. For now, let's get back into the show. And we had a guy in studio. His name's TJ, and he has a lot of weird, strange happenings around him. And I was in studio with Tony and TJ and some podcasters called Cryptids of the Corn. They know TJ very well. And TJ has had things happen since he was a kid. His connections generally are connected to nature and Bigfoot. He's had, I think, upwards of 15 different interactions with Bigfoot. And one of the most interesting things about him, when he was younger, he went out hunting with a bow and arrow. And as he got out into the woods, he felt this just innate need to put down the bow and arrow and get down on the ground and touch the ground. And when he did, he looked up and there were all these animals surrounding him. So his whole life, he's had this weird connection to animals and Bigfoot and other entities, orbs, all these different things. He's had what looks like wendigos and skinwalkers crawling on his roof. But what's interesting is they seem more scared of him than he is of them. And what's really fascinating is if we're looking at like Nephilim bloodlines, he had double rows of teeth that got taken out when he was a kid. He's fairly tall. He's about 6'4", but his kids are even taller. His brothers also had double rows of teeth that got pulled. And I've even asked him, do you think that you may have some sort of Nephilim bloodline? And he said, I've thought about it. He said, it's interesting, but even when we were younger, he said, my parents talked about giants a lot and all these different things. And he's married to a Native American woman now. So obviously she's got a lot of lore that she brings to the table when it comes to giants and different things. But first time I meet this guy, I'm asleep in the Airbnb when they get there around 4 a.m. Everything's fine. I'm there by myself. I hear them get there, but I'm in my room sleeping and, I'm half asleep, but I hear them. I go back to sleep and I would say within about 10 minutes, I felt something suffocating me, choking me out. And I look up and I couldn't see its face. I couldn't see its body. It was very shadow-like, but it was enormous. And I've seen shadow people before, but this thing was big. And I mean, it was pushing me down on the bed. And I remember telling it to step away in the name of Jesus. And what's really weird about it, there was something else in the room with us and it snatched it off of me. Like I remember seeing it getting pulled off of me and then out into nothing. And I could breathe and I was fine. And I went back to sleep. And I did talk about it on air with Tony a little bit, but I didn't suggest what I kind of thought is it was odd that when TJ showed up, this happened. And the fact that he's had so many things happen in his life, and I'm not saying he was something negative, but the fact that he's had so many different interactions may have caused that. And then recently, I would say within the past month, I was what I thought was sleeping. I don't know sometimes because we think it's a dream. Maybe it's not a dream. But I was also in a dreamscape and I was going down some corridor and the same thing. I knew it was the same thing because I felt the same way. It was like the same size, came and grabbed me by the neck again and tried to pull me through some sort of portal or some sort of doorway. And I did the same thing. And it was like something was there with me again. And he literally yanked it off of me and tossed it somewhere else, but I never saw what it was that was there with me. And I've talked to Tony about it, and we've talked about it possibly being my guardian angel or some sort of angelic being that was able to interfere with what was happening. But that was super crazy that this has happened in the past just several months. And it seems to be the same type of entity that is coming after me. And I'm not really sure why, but it's also abnormally massive. Like if I was to say, if it was a shadow Nephilim, I would think something like that. Like it's just some giant shadow creature.
It could be a shadow Nephilim. We can't take that off the table.
But I wanted to know kind of what you thought about that and maybe some of your experiences. Even before we get into this Indigo Children topic, I wanted to see what you thought about that because I like to talk to people who've been through this for a period of time and just get their reaction and what they think.
I mean, that sounds pretty wild. I don't have any experiences where there's something else in the room possibly protecting me. But I have had a couple of interesting experiences. Maybe we'll get into one of them today when we get into the MiLabs topic. But I did have a wild experience with a shadow being. Nothing big and giant like you talked about, but I had an interesting experience where it was trying to take me out of my body, and I actually had a pair of wings. And I know this sounds wild to people, but we're on a wild show, right? I mean, just what's your Free the Rabbit, right?
So yeah, you can talk about whatever you want here.
I actually had a pair of wings pop out of my back and stop me from going out of my body. So it was active. It was an active abduction. So that's probably the closest thing I have to relate to what you're discussing, where some other entity, it was not me. I didn't pop wings out of my back. I mean, that would never even occur to me. So I felt like I had some assistance in not being abducted that night. And it was an ongoing, like massive ongoing battle. But it is well known, the hitchhiker effect. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with your friend TJ. But if he attracts a phenomenon like that and he shows up to the house, I mean, that's just well known in ufology that the entities, kind of travel around, and it's kind of like a virus that gets sent around, among different groups and stuff. You have even the Skinwalker Ranch people took entities home with them to their families. And it's not necessarily anything about that person. It's just that the phenomenon is attracted to that person. And now next thing you know, it's hitchhiked onto you. And now you've brought it home. So very, very interesting. It's super cool that you seem to have something there tossing it out. I love that.
Yeah. And I can definitely say before I moved back into a relationship with God over the past 4 or 5 years, and really when I met Tony about 4.5 years ago is when I kind of started that journey. I was already moving that way, and I grew up in a very, very evangelical home. So when I walked away, there were some reasons why I did, but a lot of it was me chasing a certain level of fame and things that I wanted out of life. And I really thought that for me to get those things, I needed to broker some sort of deal with something to be able to get to where I really wanted to go in life. I know that's hard for some people to think about because they would never imagine doing something like that. But sometimes when you get kind of to that point where you feel like you're so close to something, but you think you just need something else to get there, that's kind of where I was. And I know that there was definitely a moment where I made a choice, and I've talked about it plenty of times on this show, where I was at a crossroads and all I had to do was go that way and everything would open up. But I would have also lost everything too, like my family and all of these other things. And I really just wasn't willing to do that because of a lot of values that my family instilled in me. And I wasn't ready to come back to God at the time. It took probably another 7-8 years to get to that point, but I was starting to move in a positive direction. I think everything happens when it's supposed to and when you're supposed to find the right way. I know you talked about on Tony's show, you came from a Calvinist background, but you've definitely changed a lot of ways that you think. I've known some Calvinists recently who are changing the way that they're thinking because of their involvement in a lot of stuff that we do and seeing the paranormal on the ground. Because we go out and shoot all these films and we see a lot of weird stuff when we're out there and we're in that environment. It's tough to be able to reconcile with certain things that you've been taught because it just doesn't match up anymore. And it's kind of in a different sphere. And fortunately for me, my dad was always independent. So we never were really any kind of denomination. So we weren't really locked in there. And my dad came from also a really crazy background too. He was, working to be a Satanist, and he's talked to entities and seen everything under the sun. So for my dad, when he came to God, he knew all that stuff existed and was real. And even now, when he talks about alien abductions and UFOs and all of that, I mean, he's very much on board with knowing what is going on and what kind of agenda that they're pushing. And you talked about it too, where they're definitely moving towards some sort of new world order or some sort of global religion that they're trying to create. So I think that's going to be all kind of under the auspice of whatever they're doing with quote unquote aliens, which honestly, I think they're kind of shifting now from the extraterrestrial narrative and moving more into interdimensional narrative, even in government sessions. They're talking about it in a different way. And I think even with what happened with the CAFR project and everything underneath the pyramids, where it's, all of a sudden they're talking about the halls of Amenti. And I know we were all texting in a group text about that, but yeah, it's super weird. Why are they talking about all of this religious stuff when they never would talk about that before? None of that existed. Religion's fake, God's fake. But now they're saying, well, maybe it's...
Yeah, they're going to have to bite the bullet on that one. I mean, so the upper echelon of ufology, they all know what this is. Now, they've chosen the wrong side, in my personal opinion, but they all know what this is. And it's interesting to see them on, interviews and on their tweets or however they're appearing in their media, pretending that we're all idiots and that, it's science and it's extraterrestrials and all this kind of stuff. When I know just from talk from behind the scenes, they know exactly what this is. And some of them, I'd say most of them are afraid for their lives. It's serious and they know it's serious. And they just put out this facade and they're just pretending to everyone else that it's not. And that's pretty scary. I mean, they're putting out that this is no big deal. We're just going to go out and we're going to do CE5 and we're going to contact the aliens and upgrade our consciousness. When behind the scenes, they know what they're dealing with. And they're afraid. They're not only afraid for their lives to save themselves, but they want to save themselves in the afterlife. And they don't know what to do because they've aligned with the wrong side. So, yeah, it gets pretty weird when you start talking about stuff like that with people who are on camera, pretending that all they want is disclosure.
Yeah, especially when they're the purveyors of quote unquote disclosure and they're not really disclosing the information in the way that it should be disclosed, because it is a spiritual battle and they know it, but they're going to twist it and put it out to people in a way that they need to manipulate them. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now. We're in a weird place in the world where people are very hungry for something spiritual. We've moved on from the humanist movement of the 70s, 80s, and we've kind of moved back into a very spiritual awakening. And I know just from my children, and they're in their early 20s, but my children, even their era of Gen Z and all that, you don't see a lot of atheists in that group. They're at least spiritual in some way. And I think that what they're trying to do is move them in the direction that they want them spiritually. And I think to do that, this ties right into how the episode's going, is Starseeds or Indigo Children. And I just did a complete episode on Starseeds, so we won't rehash that today, but Indigo Children.
My favorite topic is Starseeds.
I know. And I did a thorough breakdown on Starseeds and their connection to the occult, especially when you tie it back to Theosophy and Alice Bailey and Helena Blavatsky and Crowley and all of them. They all talk about a moon children, homunculus, all these different ideas of creating these vessels for entities or souls to inhabit. I know you've talked about that, snatching souls out and putting them in bodies. And later on this episode, I will talk a little bit about Crowley and one of his Libers, where he literally talks about how to pull souls out and put them into embryos. So they've been talking about this for
that's pretty wild. I want to hear that one. I'll be here
hundreds of years they've been doing this. I mean, we're talking about Paracelsus talked about how to do this, several thousand years ago. So this isn't a new concept. However, I think that the way they're moving it into a tech era of how to do it, they're moving it away from alchemy into science, and it's all the same thing. So it's, the original alchemists were the beginnings of modern day science. So they're just doing it in a different format, in my opinion, and they are creating vessels to host whatever they're trying to host. And I do think that some of it is these Nephilim spirits that are needing host bodies to be able to operate in the physical plane in a better way. But to this Indigo Children, and I'm going to kind of break down a little bit of the beginnings of it, and just so people get an idea of where we're going. But it's actually a new age concept, and it describes children with special traits or abilities. And it's based on the belief that these children are more creative and empathetic than their peers. So it's kind of the precursor to what we're seeing now with children going through the GATE programs. And this was started in the 1970s by Nancy Ann Tappe, and she wrote a book in 1982 called Understanding Your Life Through Color. Now, she was one of the first people to talk about auras and the color of auras around people. And the reason why she calls them indigo children is because when she would meet these types of children, and obviously she's a psychic as well, let's put that in the mix too, because, if we're talking about seeing auras and stuff, generally speaking, you're going to think new age and you're going to think about people that are psychic. So she definitely is in that arena. But she said she would see these children and they would have this indigo aura around them, and she knew that they were special. And if you know anything about the meditation chakra system, the indigo color is the color of the third eye, and that's where you get your spiritual sight from. And she said that they had a crazy connection to telepathy, to being able to read people, and they were special. But they also funneled in under this whole starseed umbrella, because there were all these different, and I know you know a lot about starseeds too, but you got Pleiadians, Octurians, you got the Lyrians. I mean, it's a host of them, but this is one of them, is the Indigo Children. And I guess for layman's terms, for people to understand, think 11 from Stranger Things. She would be considered an indigo child because these children have these abilities, almost superpowers as they called them. And she said that a lot of times they would be diagnosed with psychiatric disorders, attention deficit, hyperactivity, hypersensitivity, autism, bipolarity. Very typical what you see with people who have this weird connection to the spiritual world. You've got people in the scientific realm that will immediately discredit it, and they will immediately say, oh, they're just ADHD or they got autism. And I'm not saying that those things don't exist. And I've talked about plenty of times on the show that there has been a weird push in the past few years where everyone thinks they got Nephilim blood, or everyone thinks they're a Pleiadian, or everyone
And why
thinks
would you want that? I don't understand. I don't
it's that
understand.
it's that weird social media thing where everybody has to feel special
Yep.
and they want something to be able to hold on to, especially if their lives feel dull and they want to kind of concoct or create something. But here's the weird reality. It kind of works almost in reverse, because sometimes if you're actively seeking something, these entities will come and they're going to present what you think you are. Even if you don't originally have that, they'll start interacting with you, and then all of a sudden you are caught up in it now. So there is a weird twist there where you have to look at both ends of it, because it's not just the people who do have these bloodlines, which I absolutely believe in that for sure. And I think there are some people that just have a predisposition when they're born to have these connectivities and activities. So I don't throw the whole Indigo Children thing out by any stretch. I do think that there's something to it. Now, is it what Tappe's saying? I don't know. I feel like she might be in on the game, and I feel like this was kind of a setup to tie these special children into the New Age movement, which now has had a massive resurgence in the past 8 years, 10 years, where, I mean, if you type in Starseeds or Indigo Children just in a Google search engine, we're talking, I think last I read a report, it was over 4 million hits, which is crazy to think about. You go to any platform, they're everywhere, and everybody thinks they're a Starseed or this or Indigo child. And I do think there's something to it, but I do think that there's a push to drive people away from their connectivity to who the actual God is. And I think this is part of it.
I think that's the entirety of it. I mean, it seems like, Dolores Cannon's big on that, and the whole QHHT thing. Everyone is getting regressed, and everyone, was Cleopatra in a prior life, and everyone's a first wave volunteer from Delirian Starseed or Arcturus. It doesn't matter what planet it is. I mean, I don't want to say the word multiple people tried to convince me I was a starseed. They came at me from that same angle. I was even in ufology, I was getting messages, oh, you're the Anunnaki, you're a tribe of Dan, you have this special bloodline and blah, blah, blah. And they just try to play on the ego, to get you sucked into that whole New Age thing. I went straight down that rabbit hole. I went from being a very strict Calvinist to being neck deep in New Age overnight in a heartbeat. And I've said many times before, if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. I was so super strict and faithful to my own religion. I can't believe, I look back sometimes and I just think, how did that happen? How did I go from 50 some odd years of being extremely strict and religious? And don't get me wrong, I was no, saint. I'm just saying my faith was there. I went from that, and overnight I got into the New Age thing, and it's all the same stuff. You're a star seed. You have to spread this message. You have to spread the star seed message. You're a light to the world, And what's the message? If you really get into what the message is, it's all anti-Christianity. The entire message is you are God, or you can become a God, or you're a fractal of God. And it's the same exact message that was given to us in the garden. It's the reason, we're here in the first place. And it's incredibly concerning to me how fast it has spread, but how long it's been going on, because I was completely unaware of this until very recently. But to your point, this has been going on a very long time. It's the same exact tactic. You're a starseed, you're from another planet, you're here to save the world. And I'm just saying they tried it on me, and it's just all a bunch of lies. It's a bunch of nonsense. I'm not saying there aren't special people born, because you have a lot of people in ufology, the top people in ufology, who are looking for these kids. They are searching for these kids. Some of these kids are now adults. Some of them are still being born. And there is something to it. And they're looking for kids with superpowers. So it's real. But the propaganda around it is not.
Absolutely. And it makes me think about an interaction I had with somebody recently where I went into a whole episode about Alice Bailey and her connection with the Lucis Trust and the UN. And I brought up the fact that Alice Bailey and Theosophy in a whole is against Christianity, vehemently against it. And this person said, "You don't know what you're talking about. You haven't read the books of Alice Bailey. She talks about Jesus all the time." And I am trying to say, no, that she's not. Christ consciousness is completely different than talking about Jesus, who is the Son of God, who is God. That's completely different, because the New Age completely believes in Jesus. They think he's a great prophet. He's a Mahatma. He's one of the secret chiefs. He's something you can become. And that's what they sell you on, is what you said at the very core of what the New Age belief system is that you can become a god. It's Gnosticism 101. It's you can eventually surpass the demiurge and move into this pleroma and become one of the gods, become one of these Mahatmas. And I don't think that's at all what we're supposed to be doing. But now they found a way to intertwine the UFO movement and aliens into this. And Alice Bailey was a big part of that. She helped that movement a lot, because these beings that they were already talking about for the past couple hundred years, and far longer than that, but we're just talking about the modern occult movement, that's what the aliens turned into. They just became those. They just kind of shifted into these beings, and they already kind of looked like them. People were already seeing them as these spiritual advisors. But for the people in the 70s, 80s who were humanists, they had to find a way to sucker them in. So they had to say, well, these are extraterrestrials. These are beings that are a product of evolution, or they're us from the future. I'm sure you've heard that one.
Oh, I got a full download plopped straight into my brain about the whole future human thing. Yeah, I mean, these are the creatures that used to be seen during seances, and now we're seeing them on spaceships, It's pretty wild.
And I do think the spaceships are very real too, and I'm sure you do as well. And I think they've been around for a long time. And I do believe in what I call angelic technology. And I believe that this technology's been around for, we're talking hundreds of thousands, millions of years, however long that the universe has been in existence. I think this technology's been here. And I do think that they found a way to re-implement it and make it a extraterrestrial thing now, where, oh, this is advanced technology that we can teach you. We can show you how to evolve. And that's kind of what they've been telling anyone who they've either interacted with or abducted anytime they meet them. What do they always say? We're destroying the earth. They need to show us how to make it better. Oh, by the way, we got all this cool tech. We can help you out with that. Oh, and if you can, give us a little bit of sperm and eggs too, because we're trying to help repopulate, our people and try to make a better version of humanity. This is what we are. So now we need your help to do that.
Seems legit.
For sure. But back to this Indigo Children, there were two other people that came out, Lee Carroll and Jan Tober. Now, Lee Carroll is an American channeler, shocker, speaker and author, and he authored 13 books on channelings. And he has an entity he calls Cryon that he works with. And shocker, Cryon looks like every Pleiadian, gray / Octurian I've ever seen in my life. And they never look any different. And I actually did an episode literally called "Why Do Aliens Look So Much Like Us?" Because, my big joke was, if there's this massive universe, all these planets, they would look vastly different than us. Why do they always look just a shade off from us? They all do. Rarely do you hear about anything that looks very different from the way we look. So that's always a big red flag to me when I'm seeing that. And this is exactly what this Cryon looks like. And Lee Carroll, in conjunction with this entity Cryon, wrote a bunch of books on Indigo Children, and he calls the new generation of children, and they represent evolution and human consciousness. Of course they do. It kind of it kind of reminded me of, I don't know if you've heard of Daryl Anka and his entity Bashar that he channels. I'm sure you've heard of that dude. He's been around for a long time. It actually reminded me of the early version of that. Lee Carroll was kind of the precursor to Daryl Anka, who I've talked about on this show too. And yeah, they're channelers, and they're allowing the entity to take over them and speak through them and talk to people and essentially build cults out of what these entities are telling them to tell people. And, you know, some people think Daryl Anka's a big charlatan. And I'll say this, and I've seen videos with Daryl Anka. His entity that speaks through him talks to a lot of science that he wouldn't know. And I feel like that he is absolutely possessed. And I think there is something speaking through him to these people. And I don't think it's just a show per se. Now, is he deceiving people? Absolutely. But I think the entity through him is. And I think it very much ties into this Lee Carroll character as well, who was a big pusher of the Indigo Children, who basically bounced off of Nancy Ann Tappe, who came out before and was talking about the auras, which, by the way, Carol talked a lot about the auras too.
Yeah, I mean, these channelers, they all say the same thing, and it's all the same message, and it's anti-Christianity. That's what it is. I mean, we just have to spit that out and say it. Every last one of these channelers, you might as well be in an alien abduction when these people are speaking, because it's all propaganda, and the entirety of the agenda is to get us away from the true living God of the universe. That's the entirety of the agenda. If you just listen to just any of the messaging, you can listen to 5 minutes of the messaging and understand that these things are not our friends. They are anti-humanity. And their entire goal, and they come at us from a few different angles, but it's all the same message. You can be God, Christ consciousness, you can be Christ. All Christ did was come here, to unlock the Christ consciousness, and then he ascended. And that's all you have to do. And we can do it too. And that's the entirety of all of this messaging from all of the channelers. You mentioned earlier something about the old gods. There are people right now in the UFO community who are being told by the old gods, or by something pretending to be the old gods, that the old gods are looking for avatars to incarnate into human beings right now as we speak. There's an entire group of people who believe that they are avatars for the old gods. So what is the message of the old gods? All the old gods are trying to do is get worship away from the true creator and onto themselves. That's the entire agenda in a nutshell. And you can go from abductions to channelers to near-death experiences. It's all the same phenomenon, and it's all the same message. And I find it interesting that it's all the same message. Why would ETs from outer space care what our religion is? I don't think they would. I mean, it doesn't even make any sense. They might study it. They might document it. They might be interested in that type of data. But in my case, they literally held me by the hand and walked me down the road away from Christianity. Why would an ET from outer space care about my religion? It's obviously spiritual warfare, and it's being disguised very cleverly. If someone like me can get sucked into the new age, that can happen to anyone. It sounds so cool. Here we have this new take on Christianity, but it's an enlightened take. Because people back then didn't know what they were looking at. They didn't quite understand what was happening. But here's this new take on Christianity, and they wrap it up in a bow, and they sell it very easily. I mean, I almost hook, line, and sinker right down that road. So here we are. I came out the other side. It sounds like you came out the other side too, which is great. But there are so many people out there right now just getting sucked into this, and you've got people like Chris Bledsoe, who's a Christian, who used to be, I believe, a deacon in his church, telling us to go out and surrender to the universe and call on the Holy Mother, Father and Child, so that they can see a UFO or an alien. You have now the Jake Barber crew with Skywatcher telling us to do the exact same thing. And while I was largely unaware of the history, I am now looking at the future and wondering, how this is going to multiply and how many people are going to get sucked down this road. Same road I was sucked down, by the way.
Yeah, for sure. And I've got a couple of things to add to what you said, but I want to ask you a question before then. You were talking about they led your hand down and away from Christianity. I'd love to know maybe one story or two, just what they said to you about religion or what they did to do that. What was their interaction with you? Because everyone's story is different about how they do it. And I'm curious to know how they did it with you.
It's not a one story. It's many, many stories. And this happened over many months' time. And I think a lot of it is just conditioning. So during abductions, there's generally some type of medical procedure, and then there's generally some kind of lesson or some conditioning that comes. And then a lot of times I end up with the hybrid, with the kids. I call it babysitting the kids. So this happened over many, many, many months. And I was getting pushed from the outside through human beings, and I was getting pushed from the inside. And I first started out discovering the new age type of ideas. And I realized, there's probably some truth to these ideas. And it was just very slow and very gradual, where I realized, there's kind of some truth here to manifesting. There's kind of some truth here to energy work. There's truth to having a good attitude and being happy and kind of responding to the environment in certain ways. So there's a lot of truth to this. And so I was just walked down that same path as the Starseeds. I was introduced to the Elizabeth Aprils of the world. Bashar, I wasn't huge into Bashar, but I had definitely heard him. This guy, Jason Shakur. So I was getting hit from the outside. So there was a day. So first I got sucked into the new age. My husband went right along with me. I felt like I was Eve in the garden because I gave him the apple. But next thing you know, we're both sucked into the new age. You would never have thought that either one of us would. And next thing I know, one of the things that happened was we walked into a crystal shop. I was called into the crystal shop, and I probably don't have to explain that anymore. I walk into the crystal shop, and here comes a woman who approaches us, and she tells us that her guides have told her that we're special, that we are set up as a couple, that we have had many lives together, that my husband was she told him he had the power of Potiphar, and that he had lived a life in Egypt, and that her guides wanted us to know that we were going to be starseeds. Like, it was our duty to spread the message to the masses. And the message is that the aliens are the good guys, and that basically Yahweh is just a negative NHI, disguised as a god, as one of the old gods, and that the aliens are the good guys. The aliens are upgrading our consciousness. They're the white hats. Jump into the Galactic Federation. Any type of new age nonsense you could think of, she told us it was our duty to spread the word together as a couple, that we had to bring the light of the world and spread the message. So I was getting hit on the outside as well as during abductions. And it wasn't until I realized that they were transferring my soul that I started going, wait a minute, what is this? Like this, there was a big red flag for me to realize that they were transferring my soul. And that's kind of what made me stop and wonder, what are these things? They can't be aliens. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. And so, but my story is very long and very complicated. There was also a time where I downloaded some entity, most likely what we consider these days to be the lady. It's that divine feminine energy entity. I downloaded her. I was in the shower, and this entity just came and downloaded itself right into my body. And I credit that entity more so than the actual abductions, with trying to shape my mindset and trying to get me down that same road. I mean, the same road, this divine feminine, galactic federation, upgrading our consciousness, any kind of new age nonsense you could think of, that's what was coming at me. And it was coming through me because I had literally this entity literally brought herself down into my body. And I don't even know. It's my understanding from a couple different ways that she's not there anymore. She was there for a long time, most likely until I went to deliverance last year. So it was coming from inside me, from the entities, and it was coming from the outside through human beings. Well, through spirit guides, through human beings.
Yeah, that all checks with any type of extraterrestrial or spirit guide
It's the same
connection
story.
that
It's
I've
the
ever
same
heard
story
of.
over and over and over again. And man, I just hit myself upside the head for being able to. How did they get me? How did I almost? Well, I didn't almost fall for it. I fell for it. It's just that I was able to come out the other side by the grace of God. Because how I sit back and I'm like, how did they get me? How did I go from being super suspicious of any of this stuff overnight? I got sucked into it.
Well, I'll tell you how, because one of the things I was going to talk about that you brought up was the Chris Bledsoe incident. And I know we're all working behind the scenes on some interesting stuff as far as that phenomenon goes. But one of the things that happened with that resonates with me a lot is the fact that when this initially happened to him, he went to the church and they shunned him. And that is why that he went the route that he did. And I think very similar to anyone who's grown up in the church who didn't get anything from the church to help them in this department, you're not really going to believe the church anymore unless you have that foundation. And my story is a lot different than most because I was actively trying to work with evil. So for me, I knew exactly what it was. I knew what aliens were. All these things I was not blinded by. I was very much on the camp of, I'm just trying to get what I want out of this earthly world, and I'm going to use these entities to do it, even though these entities are wrecking my life. But that was my thought pattern in that. But a lot of people don't look at it that way. So when they're looking at this weird phenomenon that's happened to them, they may be still involved with the church. They go to the church and there's no one there to help them through this or even acknowledge the fact that it's happening to them. And they will just blow it off or say that, at the best, they'll say it's something demonic, but not even know how to deal with it. Because when you're looking at the New Age and when you're looking at Gnosticism, and you brought up the whole Yahweh thing, which I've been pretty hardcore on since I started the show. Again, back to, why do these entities care? If it's not something that matters, why are you bringing up these specific names? Why are these entities telling you that Yahweh is a lesser God? He's the demiurge. He's the one you have to get past. Why are they always downgrading the real true entities that are at the top down and relegating them to the bottom? We're talking about Yahweh, Jesus to an
Exactly. And
extent.
they never attack any other entity. You won't see them attacking any of the other entities. Only one. There's only one that they'll attack. They don't care about anything else.
And you brought up these other gods in these circles that are now being talked about a lot more in ufologist circles. And I completely believe in other gods. I think there are other Elohim. We know this from the Bible. We know the divine council exists. And we know there were some gods that weren't doing their jobs, that are doing other things on an evil spectrum at this point. So yeah, this is the layers. And I believe you talked about it to Tony, where you even talked about there were different levels to these beings, where you're meeting this being and this being's above this being. And then there are beings that people haven't even seen because they're so high up the chain, and these are like your generals. These are the ones that are probably in very close proximity to Hillel or Lucifer, however anybody wants to call at the top of the head. But you've got these generals and these lieutenants, and it all trickles down. And I think as you're being abducted, you're seeing different ones. That's where you get into, even on a smaller scale, reptilians, or what people would call draconians, or you get into the mantis looking ones, which are a little above the grays. And then you've got some of these, which I think that the starseed thing is a real thing in a format that would be in a spiritual way that we would understand, as far as there being hybrids. I do believe that there are hybrids. We know this from the Bible. That's not something that's a shocker as a Christian, that there are hybrids. So you think they just stop making hybrids
just
now?
Just stop for a second. Because if I had known this, I might not have gone through what I went through. I didn't know about hybrids. I didn't know about the divine council. I didn't know about the other gods. The way I was raised in Christianity was that was just a fake story. Like these other gods that other people, that other groups of people were worshiping, those were just fake gods. They weren't even real. That's what I was taught. And so, and to your point about Bledsoe, when I reached out to my pastor, who was my friend, not just a pastor, we were friends. I reached out to him. He didn't want to hear it. And this is a good man. And he did not want to hear it. I reached out to him 2 or 3 times. This is not a topic that's up for discussion. And it would always be, you don't have enough faith in Christ, you better get right with God. And this is true to some extent. I mean, by this time I was down into the New Age, but this started when I was a child. So don't tell me that I didn't have enough faith in God when I was on my hands and knees at 6 or 7 years old. So the whole thing with the church, if I had known that there was a divine council and that the hybrids were being made in Genesis 6, I might have understood this much quicker. And I might not have gotten sucked down the rabbit hole I got sucked down. Now, I do like to think, and I think I do know now, that was actually necessary for it to happen. I had to go through that, and I had to do it on my own. I had never heard of Michael Heiser. I didn't know about Chuck Missler. I didn't know about the divine council. I had to go through the ringer by myself without this knowledge and kind of come out the other side. So I had to kind of figure it all out for myself and think, what are these creatures? What is this that's happening? Why am I seeing demons? What are these reptilians? What are these animal head creatures that I'm now dealing with? I had to figure it all out. And then thank goodness when I came out the other side, there were other people talking about it. Because now I feel like, oh, okay. There was this whole hidden world to my own religion that had never been talked about. All my particular sect of religion, my particular denomination, completely took the supernatural out of the Bible, completely eliminated it. And these are good men of God, who have the faith to move a mountain. They took the supernatural out of the Bible. And so these conversations are so incredibly important.
Absolutely. And one of the guys that is on all the trips that we go on, he's a huge part. Matter of fact, he runs the production company, and he's a Calvinist, but he believes in all this stuff, and he's very much on board with it. And it's funny because Tony and I talk about it, and we're like, that's not very Calvinist of you right now, like joking with him. But a lot of people at his church are also very much on board with Genesis 6 narrative and some of these other things. And I think people in the church are starting to become way more aware. I was very fortunate as a child. My parents were always on board with all this stuff. So my dad, because of his background, knew that the supernatural existed. And I used to just ask him questions like, what's this weird thing in the Bible? What does this mean here? And then he said, well, those are giants. And when angels had sex with human women, they created giants. And, as a kid, you're like, wow, that's crazy. Because you start talking about Goliath and like, oh yeah, he's a descendant of these Nephilim and all these different things. And I just remember even as a kid, and I'm sure people on the show are tired of me talking about it, but I had books that were Christian books that were supernatural based. I had a Bigfoot book. I had a portal book. I had all these things that were written in like the 80s about this stuff with some of the guys that were Christian authors. And my mom bought all those for me. She bought me all the Frank Peretti books that talked about angelic warfare and the unseen realm. So I was very much aware of all of this stuff. I think I was too aware. So by the time I was ready to like not do what I was supposed to do, I was like, well, I know what this is, and I'm going to go ahead and start talking to it because I want to be selfish and I want what I want out of life. Fortunately for me, I had some things happen and I was able to get on a path that I am on now, but I'm able to speak to it to people that have gone through it. And I think that's important. And when I listen to abduction stories and I listen to all of these different things that people go through in this weird world that we're in, I'm able to understand it and say, yeah, it's happening. They're not lying. And yeah, I'm sure there's people that are lying out there, and I can typically pick up on some of that when it happens. But most people that are genuine about what's going on, they've seen this stuff. They're interacting with it. And when we get towards the end of this episode, I've got a theory on why that you being a Christian were still messed with. And I've got kind of a theory, because you were kind of saying that to Tony about, I'm praying all the time. I'm saying, rebuking in the name of Jesus, and this stuff's still happening. Well, I've got kind of a theory on that, because I really started thinking about it. I said, why? Because I've never really had that kind of interaction before. When I use the name of Jesus or when I'm in a situation, it typically leaves. So I've never had a scenario where I was, really, it was negated. But you're not the first person I've heard that said that it didn't work or it wasn't in the same format. And I do think there may be an answer for that, but obviously it's just going to be a theory, and I'll bring that up a little bit later. But I want to talk about these Indigo Children and some of their characteristics.
Indigo Children.
Right. So some of their descriptions and characteristics are they're empathic, curious, strong-willed. They're often perceived by friends and family as being strange, possess a clear sense of self-definition and purpose, show a strong innate subconscious spirituality from early childhood, have a strong feeling of entitlement or deserving to be here. They're highly intelligent, highly intuitive, and they resist any kind of rigid control-based paradigms of authority. So a lot of these Starseeds or Indigo Children are very much against the government narrative, which, again, one of those positives, right? One of those things that they are against, but I also think it's set up for them that way because of MiLabs and them thinking that, oh, well, we've got the government involved with these aliens. Of course, they're intertwined with some of this, and especially ones that think they're hybrids or maybe are, that they think that the government's trying to stop this wholesome alien narrative that is being told to them by these entities. And back to what you said too, it's a game, it's a ruse, and they're being told that it's positive, but when you're being shown these amazing things and you're able to do these amazing things, and you will fall into the trap. And if you don't have the background of what you talked about, the Genesis 6 narrative and this biblical foundation, and if the church is not talking about it, I talked to my pastor recently, and I sat down and had lunch, and I brought up Congress court hearings over the past couple of years and how they were talking about interdimensional beings. And I remember him saying, because he's kind of out of the loop on that stuff, he said, "Are you serious?" I'm like, yeah, man. I was like, that's why we have to be prepared. Right. I said, that's why we have to be prepared for what people in the church are going to ask about this kind of stuff. And I try to throw little things out there to people when I can that are involved in the church, just to kind of make sure that they're buzzing a little bit. So at the very least, if they're hit or blindsided, they can say, let me call Joel real quick and we could figure this out. Or at least I can get them to someone else who maybe is a little more adept at whatever they're dealing with. But I just think the church is vastly unprepared for a lot of this. However, I do think that over the past 4 years, since 2020, I think a lot of people in the church were waking up. And I think there are leaders in the church that are now changing their viewpoint or at least opening up to, there's a lot we don't know. And the Bible is a very strange book when you really look at it. And I mean that in a good way. It's very supernatural. And I hate the fact that over the past 2,000 years, slowly but surely, all the supernatural stuff was taken out. They don't even preach it. And it's back to what you said. You bring it up, that's nothing. That's not what they meant. Or, I love Genesis 6 when they try to say it's the sons of Seth. And well, in the Hebrew, it's Beni Ha-Elohim, which is denoting angelic beings. So you can't change that from the original text. But they've been taught through theology school and all of these other educational systems to dumb down the Bible. So when people are dealing with starseeds and the feeling that they're a hybrid, maybe they are, they don't know how to deal with it because they're not equipped to do it, or there's no outlet even around them to do it. So what are they going to do? They're going to go to the person that's pushing or peddling this new age narrative. And honestly, if they're dealing with entities, the entities are just going to help them along too.
Exactly what happened to me. That's exactly what happened to me. When you're trying to reconcile, how is this alien creature able to take me out of my bed at night? And what they were doing with me was what we refer to as a hybrid breeding program. And I'm trying to figure out what is happening. Well, the first explanation that comes along is not Genesis 6 from my church. No, it's, they're upgrading our consciousness. They're just making us better humans. It's human 2.0. And, or they're going to save us from a cataclysm, all the nonsense that goes around out there. That was the only explanation I got. And it wasn't from my church. So it's so important. It's so important to get the word out to Christians. And yeah, I'm happy you're doing what you're doing and happy to be here.
And to the point of it being a new religious movement, we're talking about Nancy Ann Tappe, who wrote the first book about Indigo Children, and she talked about that there was a type of Indigo child they called the interdimensional child, and they are seen as a bully, but they're expected to lead this new religious movement. As a matter of fact, there's another author, Lorna Tedder, and she's a paganist, shocker, and she wrote that every pagan woman during this period of time in the 60s through the 70s and even up until now, but especially during that period of time, that every pagan woman thought that she had an indigo child, and they would push their children into being an indigo child, even if the child wasn't even showing any kind of high IQ or any kind of special abilities. They would push them into it. And from all indications, it wasn't that the kids weren't getting any kind of interaction. It's almost like they pushed them into having interactions with these entities. And side note, I did a little extra digging, and I love digging on people. And that's one of the things I love doing on this show. And I say this a lot, that you got to follow the people, right? It's just a bunch of names until you actually track down what they do. So let me check out this Lorna Tedder, this fictional pagan writer. Well, come to find out, she was a DOD contractor officer for 3 decades, and she was involved with the Air Force during that entire time. And her whole connection was teaching people how to write and concoct creative acquisition strategies. So she was completely tied into the government. So she's writing all of these pagan fictional books, and she's talking about Indigo Children as being a thing, but she did bring up the fact that it just seemed that it was overwhelmingly amount of pagan women that said they had these Indigo Children. So then I track her down. She's a contracting officer for the DOD for 3 decades, for 30 years. So she's connected to the government behind the scenes. And funny enough, you'll see that a lot. Whenever you see these people who just seemingly seem like, oh, just your local Satanist or your local, paganist or new age purveyor, they're working for the government. So this psychic over here is working for the government.
Always working for the government. It's pretty wild when you think about it. And it's gone back how many years? Decades at minimum. Hundreds of years.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And before we jump into the MiLabs stuff, I want to talk a little bit about the waves of the Indigo Children, because there were 3 waves, and it was very interesting because they're tied also into vibrational hertz, which I thought was really crazy as I dug into it. But the first Indigo Children, they said, started to arrive in the 1940s, and then they split out over different eras into 3 waves. So like their first era was 1940s to 1970s, and their vibrational frequency was around 4 to 4.6 hertz. And their 6th chakra, which is your third eye, was well developed. And they were considered the pioneers, and they were there to break down the old systems, challenge traditional norms. This was right around that rebellious time of the 1960s and the psychedelic culture. So they were a big part of that, and they were the first wave. And then they had a second wave between 1980s, 1990s, and they were at 4.7 to 5.3 hertz, and their 6th chakra was highly developed. So they were considered harmonizers and mediators, and they were a little different. They weren't your rebels. They had more empathy, intuition. They were healers. So you could see this shift, the new age shift into like the healers and more lovey-dovey, and we're just here to work with the aliens who were, a part of us. And then the third wave happened beginning at the millennium to the present. And their vibrational frequency is stupid high. It's 5.4 to 5.9 hertz. And their 6th chakra is very highly developed. So they've surpassed the first 2 waves. And these Indigo Children are more tailored for a modern world, and really made me think of transhumanism here. They are highly spiritual, open-minded, and technologically savvy. They're more comfortable with societal changes, and they tend to exhibit a strong sense of purpose and innovation. So they're a little bit more in the category of technology, the merging of technology into spiritualism, which I honestly believe that we're getting more of now. And I want to ask you, what kind of interactions have you had with these entities that really made you realize that merge between the technology and the spiritual world? And how did they kind of sell that to you?
Wow. So they didn't sell it to me. It took me hundreds of interactions to realize that this was a lot more technology than it was spiritual. So when I've dealt with shadow people my entire existence, it seems like. I always looked at it as supernatural or paranormal, but when I started becoming very conscious of what was going on, and all I really had to do is just stop and pay attention. So I had retired, me and my husband had moved away, and I just had to stop and pay attention. And when I started paying attention to what was going on, I realized that they're actually using technology a lot of times for when I was being paralyzed or I was being taken out of my body. A lot of it was technology, and it wasn't just, some spiritual entity coming from another realm. I'm not sure if that's your exact question. But that's, I just had to have my own experience to stop and go, wait a minute, this is not just spiritual. They're using technology. These things have tech that we do not understand. They have a mastery of physics that we don't understand. And I hate to say it, but I think a lot of the woo and the supernatural and the paranormal that religious people think about is just technology we don't understand. We just haven't wrapped our minds around it yet. But yet you have the fallen angels downloading it into people's heads, all the time, including my own. When it comes down to these Indigo kids, it sounds to me like Dolores Cannon. I think I already said that, but it's Dolores Cannon. So that must have been maybe where it started. So I remember, again, I was walked down that road with Dolores Cannon, go get a QHHT regression. I think I had an appointment for one at one point. The first wave of volunteers, second wave, everybody thinks they're special. Everyone thinks they're here to save the earth and to save the planet. And I'll just call it. I think it's all alien propaganda. Are there some people here? Yes, I think there are. I think there have, probably even by this time, we now actually have hybrids being born on planet Earth. And then that's what the abduction research is showing. When that started, I don't know. But I do know that the military was working in conjunction with the so-called aliens, to do their little projects and upgrading DNA and upgrading our genes in order to make it easier to communicate with aliens in the future. So where these kids started or came from, I don't know. But I think it's all propaganda. That's just my personal opinion.
I'm with you 100% on the propaganda, and I've definitely talked about Dolores Cannon on this show too. And I want to ask you this before we jump in the gate. So you talked about souls being moved, and I did a show last year called REM cloning or REM cloning. And this was based on some of Donald Marshall's early stuff he talked about in 2012. And initially, when Donald Marshall came out, I just blew him off. I was, whatever, and I'm all about the weird, but at the same time, his
It's
stuff
a
was
lot.
just so
It's a
out
lot.
there
Yeah.
that I was like, I don't know. Is he pushing propaganda? Is he being paid to push propaganda? What is his real intention? And he's still circulating out there too. But I did this show on REM cloning, and he talks about the Mark II clones. And basically, when they would bring someone in, they would move their soul into another body to perform missions. And if they were a clone of them, it worked perfectly. It was seamless. They didn't have any issues. But if they moved them into another body, then there were some problems. You could only be in there for so long. Then it caused shorting out, all these different things. It really reminded me of what you talked about with Tony about the moving of souls, and you seeing that they were using devices to move spirits or souls out and move them into other bodies. And that was when it really clicked with me that I don't know anything about Donald Marshall. However, he did respond to that episode, which I thought was pretty crazy that
I
he
just talked
came
to
in.
Donald Marshall this last week, probably in DMs.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy, and he actually commented on that episode and said, "Good work." So I'm like, okay, well, at least I got the guy who's, came out with the whole concept that liked the episode. But yeah, so I definitely think there's something to it. And I went back and really dug through a lot of the stuff that he talked about, and I said, man, he was spot on. He was just ahead of his time, and I feel like that he was talking about things that nobody was ready for, and including myself. And then now that I've seen a bunch of really bizarre things, now I'm like, okay, I totally believe that they could move spirits or souls into other bodies to be able to perform these missions. And I know you've talked specifically about them doing that to you as well, where they've shifted your soul into something else and sent you off on, all these different things. And I'm curious for you to expound a little bit more on that, because I do think this plays into not only the hybrid situation, but also this idea of the indigo child having something else inside of them. Sometimes it's not necessarily they're a hybrid. They just have this alien essence in them is some of what they say. Even with the Starseeds, it's not so much a hybrid, even though I think some of them are. There's this whole other element to it of something being moved into them.
Yeah. So when I first came across Donald Marshall, I thought, I think I came across him on Instagram or something. I was like, this is wild, but I didn't pay any attention to what was going on. And then there was a day I was watching a podcast by Journey to Truth, and there was a gal named Elisa on the Journey to Truth podcast. And the short story is, when I first tried to watch a podcast, my entire body started vibrating, and my vision actually went to just white snow. I couldn't see it. I couldn't watch the podcast. It was very difficult for me to get into it. When I finally started watching, she was explaining there's a gentleman by the name of Donald Marshall who has his consciousness transferred out of his body. And at this point, it was happening every single night. Just a quick update for your audience. He's now stopped this. I just talked to him in DMs this last week or two ago, and he actually used a device that I tried to use to stop my own abductions, and it's working for him. So it's phenomenal news for him. So I first heard her talking about this, and I just could not believe someone else was talking about how they can transfer you out of your body. In my case, I am most frequently put into someone else's body to do my missions. And so it's not always just a clone body of myself, although the abduction research is full of abductees seeing cloned bodies of themselves. And in one case with Carla Turner's, one of Carla Turner's abductees, that abductee was told that body was for the resurrection, when Jesus comes back again, which is pretty scary. So in my opinion, it is a technology. It's a technology that I think is also a MiLabs technology. So not only the aliens have the ability to take our consciousness, or a lot of times I call it the soul. Some people might call it the astral body. Other people might call it the consciousness. It's all the same thing to me. Although there are people, especially occult practitioners, who will make a difference between the soul and the spirit. And you know that the substrate of our physical bodies, how the astral body sits inside the physical body. But they're able to transfer our consciousness out. And so the aliens do it, but the humans do it as well. And it can be sometimes be very difficult to determine whether I'm on a mission for the aliens or I'm on a mission for the humans. I think most often it's likely humans. But so it's my understanding that this started quite some time ago. So in the 1950s, the military started messing with, I mean, it probably started before that. You had the Nazis happening in the 1940s, right? You had MK Ultra coming out in the 1950s. And then the military actually started testing, as we know, our military tests on our military guys, right? So we had our intelligence agencies testing our military people. And what happened in the 1960s was a project called Project Preserve Destiny. And there's a book written about it. It's called Above Black by Dan Sherman. And when I came across this book, I couldn't believe, again, just the commonalities. It's not the same story, but the commonalities. So that came out in the 1960s. And what was happening was our own military was working supposedly alongside with the NHI on genetically engineering embryos, fetuses in the womb of mothers who were born into military families. So these mothers had genetic engineering on their progeny. Those progeny then, there's a certain percentage of military kids who will return to the military, and they know the percentage, and they know it's pretty easy to get them to come back, especially if they're already in a program or a project. And so this is where, like, your Max Spears came from. You mentioned Montauk earlier, number 11. This is probably where Penny Shepherd came from. This type of program. For myself, my mom was born in the 1950s. She was born on Mare Island. Now, I don't know what was happening on Mare Island, but it couldn't possibly have been good, because it was probably about 2023 that I heard some disembodied voice tell me that I was in something called Project, and I thought that the voice said Eternal Destiny. Now, I come to find out there's a program called Project Preserve Destiny. It's possible that I didn't hear it correctly. It's possible I didn't write it down correctly. It's possible that it's just a different program altogether. But what was happening with these kids, and this kind of ties into your Indigo Kid thing, because the Indigo Kids came out in the 1970s, right? So in the 1960s, in this program, you had these kids being genetically altered specifically to be able to communicate with the NHI in case of some type of cataclysm that was supposed to come in the future. So in the future, there's supposed to be a cataclysm where there's no communications. The grid is down. There's no way to communicate. And these people like Dan Sherman, who wrote the book Above Black, were being trained. Again, a military kid came back into the military, and now the military is training him how to communicate with the aliens. So that was happening kind of in my era, because I was born in 1968. Now, I would have been on the very, very edge of Preserve Destiny. I don't know what project came after Preserve Destiny. There's another project called Oak Tree, but I think that was before Destiny, and it was for the mothers. So my mother would have been in that. So, and then your Indigo Kids came in the 1970s. But then by the 1990s, or I guess it was the 1970s too, you had, the remote viewing program started, you had Stargate come along. Well, by that time, they were actually, and this is very controversial, it's actually classified, so most people won't talk about it, but they were at that point recruiting kids into Stargate. So you hear about Stargate, you hear about the military remote viewing program. Well, Stargate's like an umbrella program. And they were actually recruiting kids because they know that before the age of 7 years old, specifically, kids are like in the theta brainwave state most of their existence. So they start testing kids. It began with military, but then it quickly moved out into this GATE program. They start testing kids for psychic abilities, and kids who were found to be, in the upper ranges, which is your indigo kids, they end up getting pulled into these programs. I'm aware of at least 2 people I've spoken with personally who were brought into Stargate as a child. And so those kids who experienced MK Ultra programming, um, and at that time, it's my understanding they moved from like using drugs and using hypnosis to using electronics to prompt that out of body state, which is what they were looking for in these kids, to send them off into the astral realm and to send them on their missions. So they started using electronics during that time. That was in the 1990s. So if you think about, we're now in 2025, and we're talking about, even if you look at the programs that the military was doing with adults, they started out with remote viewing. Then they went into some kind of, actually, I have it written down, thought projection acquisition. And now they're actually transferring our consciousness out of our bodies and into other people's bodies. So it started with remote viewing. And then, if you remember, they actually had something. There were some people, McMonagle might have been one of them, who actually used their astral body to go do their remote viewing. But then I think Ingo Swann came along and started what he called controlled remote viewing, where he tried to stay inside his body to do his remote viewing, because being outside your body can be dangerous. So after remote viewing was supposedly shut down, they then got into the thought projection acquisition, which is being able to send the consciousness and kind of look out of that project's eyes. They were doing remote influencing. They were doing remote assassinations. If you listened to Ray Boucher or read the book Final Events, you had those DoD employees come forward and discuss remote assassinations were happening within our own Department of Defense. This was happening. And so they're recruiting adults, they're recruiting kids. And then you had, the whole Monarch program. That was another just big umbrella program where they were recruiting kids through GATE and using, the MK Ultra techniques on them. So fast forward to today, what's happening right now today in ufology is these kids who were subject in the 1960s and 70s, and some of them went into Stargate. Some of them, I know a girl who was in Stargate and she was in Looking Glass, recruited as a child, and they used her all the way up until she was a teenager. Separate from that, you have other kids who were MK Ultra project kids involved in some of these projects, and there's many, many, many names for these projects. It's not just one. These kids are now being recalled into service as the psionic assets for the Skywatcher program. And it's interesting because it also ties into the telepathy tapes. So have you seen the telepathy tapes? So I have not watched the tapes. I just have people contacting me and saying that they are now recruiting kids again. So whether they ever stopped, I don't know. But they're recruiting these indigo children, these kids who seem to have they have heightened psychic abilities, at least some of them. They're recruiting them into these programs. And what is the purpose of these programs but to contact non-human intelligence? So in my personal opinion, I don't know if I was farmed out. I don't even know how I got into these projects. If I look at my history, there's a lot there, but I can't tell you, oh, I was recruited into, Stargate. I was recruited into Looking Glass. No, what I can tell you is that these creatures call me by a number. That number is number 18. And that being called by a number is a hallmark of being in an MK Ultra program. I was very recently hit up in a soft way to kind of get recalled back into that program. So this isn't just something that happened in the past. It's something that's still happening. If you even look at some of the upper echelons of ufology, they're putting on displays where they're bringing kids over from other countries and they're displaying things like telekinesis. So our military industrial complex, and the aliens are interested in kids who have these abilities, these indigo children. They're literally hunting them down and bringing them into programs. They're enticing their parents. You mentioned earlier about these pagan mothers who just wanted their kids, to be special. Well, that's happening still right now. You have parents of kids who are on the spectrum who are being contacted by people, behind the scenes. Nobody wants to talk about who's doing it, and being encouraged to get their kids signed up for these programs. So it's getting really weird in this day and age. We're not just talking about something that happened, in the 1970s with the Indigo kids. We're talking about it's still happening today. Our military is still interested in these kids. We have now billionaires funding these projects. They're interested in these kids. And then they're also interested in recalling these adults who are program kids, from way back then, the Indigo kids, who are now being, they're being recalled back into the program to work as adults. When it comes to transferring the consciousness, I don't know how they're doing it. I wish I did. I've used so many pieces of technology to stop what they're doing, to stop them from transferring my consciousness. It's actually kind of interesting because when we talk about Donald Marshall, I don't know his full story, but he believes that he's getting taken to something called a cloning center. And it's pretty much every night. And there's some pretty wild stuff happening there in his story. I have not, thank heaven, been to the cloning center, that I'm aware of. But it's interesting to me that whatever's happening with this technology, a device that I used to try to stop these abductions is working for him. So whatever it is, there's a different technology that's being used to access him and his consciousness. It's different than mine. So I think there's just a lot of different programs out there. I think there's probably even, competing programs. There's probably competing factions. You're going to have your deep, dark aspects of the military industrial complex. You got Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. They're fighting it out with our own military. So there's so many different factions involved, so many probably different levels of technology that they have access to. It's also my understanding that the military, they have equipment to stop. They have the equipment to stop this, and they have the equipment to stop abductions, but they're not going to share it with us. So, we're just kind of on our own trying to figure out what's going on, what technology are they using, and how can we stop it? And I'm still here today, right here, not knowing how to stop it. And if anybody out there in your audience knows, please send me a message.
So I do agree with you that I think that the military industrial complex has technology to combat what these entities are doing. However, I don't know if they're fully aware of the capabilities of these entities either. I think they understand it way more than we do, but I do think there's a lot of variables that they don't. And I think that's why that they allow the abductions to happen and then they re-abduct people because they're trying to get to the bottom of what's actually going on. And yeah, I think they're working hand in hand with some of these entities for sure. You hear plenty of abduction scenarios where people go to underground bases, these dumps, and there are people working right alongside greys or reptilians or whatever else, sometimes cloning facilities. Generally, what I hear though, these are gestation places where they're trying to create hybrids, and these people in the government are working alongside these greys and some of these other entities to make that happen. And I think that back to the Indigo Children and something you just said, it made me think of this. I wonder if, because the Indigo Children were said to have appeared around the 1940s, and I wonder if the idea of the Indigo Children was put in the zeitgeist to get people who were already wrapped up in the New Age, who were already thinking, oh, my child's special, and they see their child doing something that's abnormal, and then they start talking about it, and then it gets out, and then the government knows better how to zone in on these kids. So I wonder if that was part of the game, is to put a label on it early. Then you've got these people who are involved in New Age, sometimes not even involved in New Age. They just hear about Indigo Children and, well, my child's like that. They're doing strange stuff. So it gets out. They may go and talk to someone. That someone may be connected to someone with the government. Before you know it, that's how a lot of that could have started too, at least spotting out the children early on in, the 1960s, 1970s, when they were actually starting to come after a lot of these children. So I think that they have games, especially back then, where we didn't have internet like we do now, where people are constantly talking online, or they can find some sort of paper trail online to be able to zone in on these kids like they can now. A kid will just be on TikTok talking about they're doing weird stuff, and the government's like, whoop, there, let's go over here. We can track this kid down. Whereas back then they couldn't. So maybe you put a label on it. People start saying their child's this way. Government comes in, and it kind of leads into the whole GATE program, which stands for Gifted and Talented Education. And it's a program designed to provide specialized academic instructions for students with exceptional abilities, aiming to meet their unique learning needs. Sounds great, right? And I'm sure that there are plenty of kids that go through GATE that aren't getting abducted. So I don't think it's all of them, but I do think GATE is put in place to be able to track out these extra special kids. Because when I was doing research on GATE, and we're just talking about regular research, we're not talking about digging through some dark clandestine website to get information, but they say gifted assessment, and how they do the assessment's weird too, because they use a psychologist and a psychometrist, and they don't really have a set test that they do. They got like the WISC 4, they got the SB5, they got all these different tests, and there's different variables about how they test each kid. So none of it's the same. There's no real one trackable test. And the best part about the GATE program, this isn't just like an American program. I mean, they got versions of it all over the world. So they've been doing this everywhere. So I thought that was really crazy with GATE when they talk about how they test. They can't even tell you how they test because there's no one test. It's just, we take this kid and we'll test them how we think they need to be tested.
Yeah. And now you've got a ton of people who were identified in GATE. And these are people who are self-reporting. So they're saying, I was identified in GATE, and I started getting taken out of my class, and I started going to this weird place where they sent me out of my body, where they taught me how to fly a spaceship. So there's definitely some interesting things going on in GATE. The people who have been recalled as the new psionic asset is the new name for it, to go out with Skywatcher, and there's black programs behind Skywatcher, is my understanding, to go out and call in these NHI. They all learned it. Not all, I shouldn't say all. At least some of them learned these processes while they were in GATE. And it's not the GATE teachers teaching them how to do this. It's actually the intelligence agencies separating these kids out by whatever means, however they're being identified by that testing that you talked about. They're getting taken out of class, and they're learning how to fly spaceships and use their astral body to go on spying missions. That's what at least some of these GATE kids were doing. And now those kids, half of them are working for intelligence agencies, half of them are pretty high up in our military, and some of them are now civilians, but they're being, called back in. They're being identified again. There's just in our little tiny UFO community, I'm aware of multiple people who were in GATE. Most of them, half of them at least, are abductees. Some of them call themselves experiencers because there's a whole lot of overlap there. And now they're being asked, to come into this program where they're going out and, praying to the night sky to see an alien.
Yeah, CE5 something else. And I've been on deck when people were doing CE5. I wasn't part of it, but they just did it, and I didn't know they were doing it. And then all of a sudden I'm looking up, and there's UFOs coming in close. And yeah, interesting stuff. And if you track the CE5 rabbit hole back to some of the top dogs pushing that, they're connected to the government. Let's be real. They may say they're not, but it's pretty obvious that they are, and they are pushing a narrative. And it's funny, the top people pushing CE5 are really against Christianity. They really have a problem with it. And you bring it up, they get really mad. They don't want to talk about it, yet they believe in a spiritual existence. And they'll show you all the pictures they take when they're doing CE5, and they got lamb-like entities walking through and all these grays shape-shifting, and well, they're just our spirit guides, right? That's what they're always going to say. But as soon as you start bringing up the other part of it, the spiritual existence, they get super mad. And that's one of the things I've always found fascinating about Christianity. And I'm not talking about the negative aspects that can come with Christianity, because there are people who claim they're Christians, who push a very negative outlook, who I don't think really are Christians, but I think maybe they could be psyops themselves that are trying to take it down from the inside. But you have people, even good people sometimes, that are Christians that just don't have love and compassion, and they run people off from Christianity. So I understand why there is a negative aspect to it, but I have found myself talking to people about Christianity or God or Jesus in a certain way, and they just start getting angry, and you can see it welling up in them. They don't even know why they're getting angry. They're just getting angry. And especially in this paranormal space, this extraterrestrial, interdimensional space that we talk about to people with, you start bringing up God and Jesus, they just get angry. And they'll come a million ways why it's not true, but yet they're really open to these spirit guides helping us, because the spirit guides are selling them on the fact that they can essentially become a god themselves. And that's way more attractive. But that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. So that's all the way back to, hey, take this. You can have all of the knowledge of good and evil, and then you'll become like a god. And I think we're still seeing that now. It's just in a brand new format.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's going on. And again, when I talk to people, so I always have to stop and I always have to understand that any information I get that's in the so-called back channels, it could be bad information. I could be getting information seeded, and then I'm meant to spread it out there. So I always take that into consideration. But I think it's true. The upper echelon of ufology you talk about, there's a whole lot of them who know. I said this earlier in the podcast. They know exactly what this is. They just don't want us to know. They want us to feel stupid and unenlightened. They like to say that religious people way back in the day, we just didn't know what we were looking at. These are just, the Anunnaki. They're from whatever planet, and we just didn't understand that what we were looking at. And and when we wrote it down, or when the scriptures were written, there's scriptures all over the world that were written. We just didn't have a full understanding of what it was. And anyone who still believes that way is just ignorant, or maybe even just stupid. They kind of treat us like second-class citizens because we're not enlightened. But man, I think they know exactly what this is. I think they know that they've chosen the wrong side. And what's really sad is they want us to choose the wrong side too. They want more and more people to go down with them. It's like, if they can't make it, they're just going to take anyone they can. And a lot of them are going to be Christians.
Yeah, that's a trickle-down effect. That's like working at a job where you got the top boss and something bad's happening, so he beats down the manager underneath him. The manager beats down the manager underneath him. It's kind of like you go to the top and you've got Hillel, Lucifer, whatever you want to call him, and then he knows he's going down in the end, so he's beating down his people below him. They're beating down the humans that work for them. They know they're going down, so they're trying to get as many people as they can to fall into the trap. And I think it all starts at the top. It all starts at the corruption, right? They're trying to recreate the times before Noah. They're trying to bring those times back again. And I think they're getting close to it. It might not be super close. I mean, that's up for debate, but I think they're moving towards it. At least that's what they want to do. And I want to shift into this very interesting stories. I won't talk about all of them here, but this is a lady called Leah Haley, and I just watched a documentary with her. It's called MiLabs, Military Mind Control and Alien Abduction. And there's a book called the same thing written by Helmut Lammer, and he's actually a PhD at Austrian Academy of Sciences and Space Research. So this guy's stupid smart. He does lectures on astrophysics, and the guy did a whole book on MiLabs. But she did a lecture called the same thing. You can actually purchase it or rent it on Amazon Prime. So if you guys get a chance, check that out. I watched it. Listen, the quality's not great. I think 15 minutes in, I think I told you off air, Fringe, that the audio wasn't even matching up with the visual, but I still enjoyed it because the info was so good. I mean, I was just wrapped up in the info, and she's got some really interesting pictures. She's got pictures of markings on her body. She's got one picture of a device that was found underneath her gums. She's got pictures of black helicopters that she's caught flying over her place where she lived originally. She's got a lot, and she's got a lot of really good stories, but I found it fascinating that she kind of had a background similar to yours. She was a Southern Baptist, and she grew up that way her whole life, and then just one day started getting abducted. And she started, initially, she believed everything was extraterrestrial. It was some sort of entities. Funny enough, she refers to these entities a lot in satanic terms. So I found it very fascinating because this was done in the early 2000s up to like 2010. I can't remember the exact date when she did this, but it was around that era of time. And she was referring to them as that even back in the 90s. So she was very aware of it not being a good thing. She never referred to it being good. She always referred to it being very negative. She did say it ruined her marriage, and because she decided to come forward and start telling people because she felt like there were other people that needed to know about this. Her husband left her for it, and her daughter won't talk to her anymore because of it. And she's remarried now, and she's, pushing this as much as she can. And she talks about the connection between the actual entity abductions and then the MiLab abductions, because she didn't really know about MiLabs until later on. And she heard some people like Gloria Hawker talking about it, and then Helmut Lammer, obviously. And then she got this whole idea that, well, maybe not all these abductions are alien. Maybe some of these are human ones. As a matter of fact, she mentions that the human ones were worse than the non-human ones. The experience that she had in these abductions, because she said that the human ones were way more cold, calculated. They were trying to extract information. And she said she denied them information all the time, and they would just give her as many drugs as they could. They would put her through all of these different tests to try to get her to speak. She did talk about the first time that she knew something was wrong, because she had been having interactions with grays, your typical reptilians, a little bit here and there. One of the first times that she realized that something wasn't right, she said she was in a line and they were all drugged, but she said she may have had more of a higher tolerance, kind of like you talked about. You have typically high tolerance to some of the drugs that you're given. So you typically, you've had times where you awake during when these things are happening, whereas some other people might not. They might be sedated the whole time. So she says she's in line and she looks in front of her and she doesn't recognize any of the humans in front of her. And she looks behind her, and she said she thought she recognized one of the other ladies that she had talked to over the past few years that had been abducted too. She realized that wasn't her because she was kind of moving around. And she said that one of the grays was moving weird. And she said, that's weird. The arms are bending and the knees are bending like a human would. And so she said she just kind of stumbled out of the line and basically acted like she was just didn't know where she was at and kind of walked up to the alien. And she got close enough to realize that the eyes were stitched on and it was a suit. And it was a female underneath the suit. And she said she didn't want them to know that she'd figured it out. And she just kind of stumbled back in line. And she said from then on, she started really going down the rabbit hole of trying to understand these military operations and what they were trying to do. And she said they even got to the point where she was receiving these downloads and she's very much like you, where she's very skeptical about where information is coming from. She knows it could be coming from a negative source. She talks about these voices in her head that started showing up. And she said it was a male voice, and they would talk to her, tell her to do stuff, tell her to hurt herself. She said, generally speaking, she could snap out of it and not, but she believes that was very military based, that they had some sort of technology that they were talking to her. But she said that not only that, but then you had the non-human intelligence angle where they were also talking to her and they were downloading info into her as well, where it was such a huge confusion because she would go through parts where the humans were telling her to hurt herself, or what she thought at least, but then she would get these downloads from what she thought was non-human intelligence. And I've got one for you. I want you to hear this and just listen to how manipulative this stuff is. So this voice said that he was God. And this was the exact words that she said that she wrote down after this incident. And it said, after these events have occurred as recorded, the family of God will be transported away from Earth to another universe. They are now being prepared for the journey that is to take place. The Earth will meet with destruction. Ignited by man, a total upheaval will occur, been selected to ensure their species' continued existence. They are being prepared for adaptation to their new environment. There's much work to be done before the Odyssey can take place. Time is of the essence. Faith is important. Faith is the reason not everyone knows belief in God is a prerequisite, not proof and not evidence. The family of God will be delivered from Earth by their cohorts. The Odyssey is to take place swiftly and precipitously. The family of God know they're being prepared and are being given their instructions. So she's getting a download that's telling her that it's God telling her to get ready to go off Earth with these aliens because this is what God wants. This is the continued survival of the species, the classic. But the fact that this voice was telling her that it was God was mind-blowing. And she even attributed it to cults and how cults operate, kind of like the Heaven's Gate suicide cult, where they also use the verbiage, the family of God know they're being prepared and are being given their instructions. That exact verbiage was used with Heaven Gate suicide cult. And she immediately zoned in when that download was given to her. She knew this is not good. I know about Heaven's Gate suicide cult. This was the same. She actually went and looked it up and said, it's the same thing that was said there, almost word for word. And they use the word container a lot for the human body, where it's a vessel, it's a container, it's housing the soul that can always be moved. And I think that could even tie into when we're talking about vehicles and spiritual spaceships. You can tie it into, we go all the way back to like the Merkaba and what people talk about, the wheels of Ezekiel and the six-pointed star. And this gets into a whole other conversation of sacred geometry, which I think is all tied into these angelic beings and also tied into how that these beings operate in this sacred geometric space because they've seen God do it. They're just trying to mimic what God's already done. And they are essentially trying to move souls out of containers into new containers. And I believe that they're creating containers for not only to move souls around, but I really think the ultimate goal is to put these Nephilim spirits into containers. And I have a theory that's called the Nephilim portal baby theory that I've been pushing for the last 3 years. And the big part of that is what I call the meat sacks. They create these meat sacks for these Nephilim spirits to house, and they're trying to move them in there. And I honestly think that's a lot of what these grays are. These grays are just basically meat sacks that are housing something else inside of it. And however you want to say what the grays are, technology, I know there's a lot of different ideas, but I do think they're housing something. And I think they're very negative, and I do attribute it more of the Nephilim spirit type. But yeah, I thought that was really wild that she brought that up, that this download came to her and literally said, this is God, you need to listen to me and start changing your ways and get ready for an off-world movement. You got to save the universe. And I just was pretty blown away when she broke that down. And then to her to come from a spiritual Christian background and be able to speak to it in that way, I thought was very, very telling.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds pretty wild, but it sounds very similar, to what I went through. I did not understand what was happening to me. I was having these experiences with what I believed were aliens, but I was also seeing a lot of humans, a lot of hybrids. I've seen people in contractors' uniforms, the reptilians, which I most closely associate with MiLabs because of some incidents that happened. But it can be very confusing. I had no idea that MiLabs were related to anything until these creatures were calling me by a number. And I just went,
Mm.
wait a second. The aliens don't call me anything. Everything's just known in that environment. So it's interesting that she was able to separate these things. I mean, I went through a period where, and I still question everything. I have gone through a period where, is this all just happening in some weird spiritual realm? Is it spiritual? Is it physical? What are these entities? And once I realized they were calling me by a number, I had to entertain the possibility that the entire thing was the military industrial complex working side by side with these non-humans. I've entertained the possibility that the entire thing is just fake and, people and creatures just dressed up like gray aliens, which is what it sounds like she came across. But we have so there's ufology, but then there's a whole community of people who are MK Ultra, people who are in the satanic ritual abuse community and the TI community. And what I love to do is I love to talk to them because they are the ones coming to abductees and saying, do you understand our military industrial complex? And I say that in a very large way because when I say that, I mean our contractors like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, to name a couple. We have the technology. They are sending out downloads from these quantum computers in deep underground military bases, which I've been in. And they're creating chimeras and hybrids in there. And they're sending out downloads that people think are coming from NHI, but it's really just the same old voice of God technology that we've had for many, many years. And they're using it on humans. They're using it on people. They're using it on abductees. It used to be MiLabs was all about re-abducting alien abductees and trying to figure out what they knew, what technology they saw. Did they see any symbols? Did they fly the ship? And I think at some point they were even trying to send abductees in as spies to the alien technology. But it seems like it's morphed from there. I'm not saying that's not still going on, but it seems like it has evolved into this whole weird thing where they're pretending, to the channelings, some of those channelings. I mean, there are people who think that the law of one was channeled by our military industrial complex and possibly not even the Council of Nine. Now, there are reasons on both sides to think it could be one way or the other. But just the idea that we are mimicking alien abductions, we're pretending to do alien abductions, to serve some agenda. I don't even know what it is. Power and control at bare minimum. I think they're looking for immortality. Ultimately, I think that's what the idea is. They're looking for immortality, but it's impressive, and I'm going to watch that because it's impressive that she was able to figure out that this might not actually be God, because I cannot tell you the number of people who just fall for that message. If the messages fall right into your head. Sometimes I even hear a little power up type sound that you would hear on a video game. Messages gets plopped into my head, and I know everything there is to know about the entire universe in those moments. And it's really important for us to question these messages, whether it's coming from a non-human, whether it's coming from human technology. Questioning the messages, I think, is probably one of our primary goals. It's interesting that she was able to figure it out. The entities I most closely associate with my own MiLabs, they're reptilian entities, and they're not your average everyday reptilian looking entity. This is something at the time that I had never come across. At the time, I couldn't figure out why these creatures had this reddish pinkish skin. And what it was they would have a human facade, and then underneath the human skin was this reddish pink reptilian skin. And it did I later on came across the Stranger Things creature, and it reminds me of that type of skin. It's almost like it's burned or crispy. And these are the creatures. They look human, but they're not, and they call me by a number. Well, that's MK Ultra programming. So I don't know how I got into it. I don't know how I'm even still into it. But these are the creatures, I believe, behind the transferring of my consciousness and, sending me out on these spy missions. And sometimes I'm smuggling things. Like I know that I have to get something from one place to another. There are times when it feels like I'm just in some kind of training scenario too. There are times when I don't think it's real at all. And actually, I kind of question whether any of it's actually real. But the problem is I've now been in other people's bodies whom I know, and I've been able to verify that I've been in that person's body. I mean, I can tell them what they were wearing that day, where they were at, and what they were doing. So I've kind of gone from thinking maybe the whole thing could be training to maybe some of it's not, because I now know that I go into other people's bodies. So yeah, I'm going to watch that. I have it written down. It sounds really interesting. And I don't think there are too many people who are able to figure out that there's so much overlap going on between the military industrial complex and the actual aliens that it can be very, very difficult to even figure out who has me, where am I at, what do they want? What am I supposed to be doing right now? The lines of people she's talking about, I can't tell you that zombies. All I see is mostly people. I call them zombies, are in the zombie mode. They're completely out of it. They have no idea what's going on. And they're probably going to wake up in the morning and not have a clue, that they were either in an underground military base or on a spaceship, and who knows what they're being used for. Most of it seems to be related to this hybrid program, but there are other things going on as well.
Yeah, I'm with you. When I watched the documentary, it was a conference where she spoke at, and her ability to figure things out fairly quickly really fascinated
Took me a very long time to figure it out. I've said before, I'm embarrassed by how long it took me.
And I'm not saying she hadn't been abducted for a while before she did, but she was able to figure out some key components. One of them being that wasn't God talking to me. And the other one was she was able to figure out when she was being abducted by non-human intelligence or when she was being abducted by MiLabs. In one of her stories, she talks about that there was military individuals that she saw, so she knew she was in some sort of MiLabs, and there was a small alien that was with one of the top generals, and it wasn't a gray, did have kind of a biggish head, but it really had like more of a Ripley type of head, and it was small. We're talking about 2 feet, and it was just also interrogating with him. So it was a different type of alien that she hadn't seen in any other place but working with these military people, which I thought was super interesting too. So is this some sort of opposing, or as I'm going to tell you here in a minute, I'm going to break down this Crowley thing for you and show you that there's a whole operation on how to implement souls into these essentially meat sacks, these embryos that they're housing, and this is done by human means. So was that what one of these were? Another thing she said, she was able to start deciphering the lights. So she said when she was abducted by NIHs and she looked at the lights, she never could tell where the lights were coming from. It was just light. And it was definitely of foreign origin. But she said she was able to zone in and know that it was MiLabs because she could see bulbs in different parts of the room. She was able to start deciphering and say, okay, these are people dressed up as aliens. This isn't actually aliens that are doing something to me. Or she'd start spotting out military personnel. And she was able to start doing that, which I thought was really interesting. Also, she said that when she was being implemented with a process to help her forget what was going on, there would be these bright white lights and symbols placed in her head. And she said that would only happen in MiLabs. So she did attribute MK Ultra to a lot of this. And she said that it for sure played a part in what she was doing. And she said that they kept tabs on her heavy. and they would know when she was abducted. Matter of fact, this was one of the wildest stories. So non-human intelligence abducts her, drops her off in a field not too far away from her house, but they didn't drop her off at the house. She said that, which was really weird. Dropped her off in a field. Right after that, helicopter shows up, and then she's abducted by MiLabs, and then they're interrogating her about what happened. They literally were tracking her being abducted by MiLabs and then, or by non-human intelligence, and then they were trying to get the info off of her. And she said, from what I can tell, she didn't break, and that was kind of the problem. Like, they weren't really getting info from her. However, she's also very intelligent. She said there were times that she would have full days that were missing. And she talked about MK Ultra, specifically a story where she knew about a incident that was part of the MK Ultra documents that were released, which were thousands and thousands of documents that you can read online. And one of the stories was a lady who hated guns, hated them. And they, through a process, were able to get her to pick up a gun and shoot one of her friends. Now, in the documents, it said it was blank, so we don't really know if that's true or not, but that's what she said. So she had read a lot of those MK Ultra documents, and she felt like that the MiLabs part of it was very MK Ultra-ish, whereas the non-human intelligence part of it, they had a whole different purpose in mind. And the MiLabs operation was trying to figure out what was going on these spaceships or on these ships that the non-human intelligence are working off of. It's very fascinating. There's way more to it than what I just talked about today, but I encourage people to go check that out. And I'm going to shift into this homunculus thing so you can hear about this, because I know you were interested in the Aleister Crowley part of it. And it's a really big part of a film I have coming out towards the end of the year that we shot last year for a month, and I've tied Crowley to a lot of cryptid activity and a lot of things that happened while he was in the States. But one of those is a Liber that he wrote called Liber 367, De Homuncle of the Homunculus. And in this document, and this isn't going to be new to my listeners because they've heard me talk about this before, but he talks about how to create an artificial fetus and then implement a soul within 3 months. So at 3-month period, you implement the soul. And he literally says in the first line, the homunculus is a living being in form representing man, possessing those qualities of man which distinguish him from beast, namely intellect and power of speech, but neither begotten and born after the manner of human generation, nor inhabited by a human soul. So this is an artificial. Now, they do use human egg. This is very similar to like IVF or something like that. So he creates the process of how to do this. Interestingly enough, though, as you go through the document about how he's able to do it, he talks about that you have to have angelic beings with you whenever you're doing this. So he talks about if this is accepted, so if everything's right, you've done the ritual right, you've done the process right, you have to find a way to bar the gate against any human ego, and then to cause the incarnation of some non-human being, such as an elemental or planetary spirit, of a nature fitted to some desired end. Thus, one eloquent from an incarnation of Tyrael, or one bold in word with the indwelling of Graphiel. So you just named 2 angelic beings. As a matter of fact, the next line, he talks about how to invoke the spirit using Nakael, Raphael, Haniel, or Aniel. So he names off several angelic beings that have to be with you whenever you perform this ritual of putting the soul into this meat sack, for lack of a better word, this body that you create. So this is what these ancient alchemists have been doing for a long time. They've been doing this. I just think that now we've upgraded it into the modern world about how we're doing it. I think these guys have been doing it. I don't think this is anything new. You know, there's a verse in the Bible that says there's nothing new under the sun. King Solomon talks about this. So I think, again, this is just the new upgraded version of it. And what is the military trying to do? What kind of information are they trying to extract from people like you, people like the lady that we just talked about here? You know, I'm not really sure exactly what their end game is. Are they trying to copy what these non-human intelligence have already done. I mean, we know they like to do that. So I think there's so many different aspects to it. And you do have kind of a few warring factions that are going on. Yeah, humans are working with them, but to what end, really? I think ultimately they're scared of them. And I think some of them are at least trying to find a way out. And to your point, some of them know they're done, they're cooked. So they're just trying to take whoever else down with them.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think, it is all just the same thing. They've just upgraded their technology, and, they might be doing it in a more, they're using genetics and technology, but at the same time, to your point, and I'm wondering if you might, I think Nathaniel Gillis was on with Tony, but I think he would be great for the theory that you just put out there, because he's going to be well versed in, he's got some theory on the hybrids that sounds pretty wild, but I think you'd be very interested in it. So one of the things that's interesting to me is that the aliens, it's the grays, but it's really the mantids in charge. And then you got the reptilians in there somewhere. You got your tall grays, your medium grays, your small grays. They're using technology to create these hybrids. It's taken them many, many years. The hybrids have gone from looking very hybrid-like, with the really thin hair and super sickly looking and fragile, to they now look human. So it's taken them a long time to get there, but they've gotten there. But what's crazy to me, and something that we should be thinking about, which might somehow match up with your theory, is it's interesting to me that they're still using human women as portals or something for the human soul, potentially, because they're still using human women. What they could grow in a petri dish, they're implanting human women still. And they're now to the point where they're sometimes taking the embryos, whatever stage you want to talk about. They're sometimes taking the embryos right around 4 weeks, sometimes 6 or 8 weeks. It used to be 3 months, 4 months, but it's getting less and less time. But why are they still using human women? There is a reason for that. It has to be metaphysical, because it makes no sense otherwise. But so to me, it has to do with the soul. It has to be. Why aren't they just cooking us in a dish? Why aren't they just putting all of their egg matches up? Because what they're doing right now is they're matching up hybrids. So right now the project is they're matching up hybrid, say male DNA, hybrid DNA with a human female. And so why not just cook that up in a petri dish and put it into their womb, into their fake artificial wombs on board? Why not just do that? But no, they're implanting women. There are women still right now today who are being taken every single month trying to get a viable fetus out of the woman. And it a lot of times it doesn't work. It's not like they're getting babies every single month. They're only getting babies, it's only successful sometimes. It's not always successful. So why are they doing that? Where are the fallen angels who might have to be present, for this to be successful? There's a really interesting story. I think you'd be interested in it, so I'm going to tell it really quick. Keep in mind that this story might not be true or real, because this was something that was conveyed by a hybrid to an abductee, and it was something that was transferred into the abductee's mind in a picture. So that's the background to it, but it's fascinating because she asked the hybrid what was his concept of God, or who was God to the hybrid. And the hybrid sent the projection into the abductee's mind. And I'll do my best to explain it. But basically what the abductee saw was a handful of mantid beings in their little purple robes, all standing in a circle. And the mantids are extremely psychically powerful. And they were concentrating all of their psychic power into the middle of this circle. And what emerged in the middle of the circle was a non-corporeal being. And this non-corporeal being was what the hybrid perceived as God. And very clearly, what the mantids are referred to as the ancients. They are the oldest of, I think they're hybrids. They're the oldest of the so-called alien creatures. The ancients were focusing all of their psychic power into a circle, so that this non-corporeal being could emerge. What is that non-corporeal being? But potentially one of the angels, one of the fallen angels, one of the baby gods or the little g gods, potentially in that circle. And so that's what the hybrid perceived as God, was a non-corporeal being that was in the hierarchy above the manted beings.
Yeah, that's wild. And if we're suggesting anything we've suggested today, I can take it on board as being true. It could be totally false. It could, like you say, it could just be a download that's there to manipulate, for sure. But I'm not going to throw it out either and just say it's just completely false, because
and I don't throw it out. When I found that out, I thought, oh, well, this is just all making sense, is it? Because so the hybrids are not allowed to think about God or to talk about a God, or there's no religion allowed in that society. And so when he projected what was his closest idea to God, and it was a non-corporeal entity, I found it fascinating.
Mm. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. And I'm a little blown away with that one. That's pretty wild. And it makes sense, because if you have some sort of hybrid who would be considered some sort of version of a Nephilim, and they're looking at, daddy, that's their daddy or whatever. So, hey,
It was the boss. It was the boss. That's for sure.
Right. For sure. And yeah, this has been a fascinating episode for sure. I've got a couple of very positive notes to end on. I like to try to do that, especially when we go pretty deep. And I've got a couple of very, nice things on the way out for people. And one of them is Ephesians 6:10-11. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his power. Put on the full armor of God so you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. I think it's very important for us to keep the armor of God. I want to say to you, I said I had something that I thought that I've theorized on since you've said why. And it was interesting because so did Leah. She said the same thing. Why? Because of her situation growing up in a Christian background, and why is this happening? And I really thought about that. I was like, why is it that some people have to go through this even though they have a strong faith in God? Well, we don't know why God does things, and we don't know why he allows certain things to happen. But what I will say is this: maybe he is allowing you and some of these other people of faith to go through some of this because you're able to help others go down the path that he wants them to go down, and them to understand what's going on. I know it seems rough, and it seems like you're going through a lot. And if you look at some of the ancient prophets in the Bible, they went through hell. And you look at a lot of people I've known personally in my life, not necessarily going through abductions, but other demonic activity and other things that are going on. And you wonder why that happens. Well, I believe that God has built all of us with a purpose. So maybe that is the purpose that you have in the moment right now, because you just have a greater purpose than other people when it comes to this spiritual realm. And maybe you are supposed to go through that so you can help the others that are going through that to see what it is that they need to do to be able to combat at least the wrong outlook on what's happening to them, because they're going out and they're spewing what these entities are telling them to say. Maybe you guys are there to say what God wants you to say about what's happening. And I do believe that God has a greater plan regardless. I don't know what that is in every case, but that's just me theorizing, because I really thought long and hard about that. And I'm like, I wonder what it is that your journey is, and what this Leah woman's journey is, and other people that are going through it that are Christians, that are coming back to their faith. And, the good thing with you is you came back to your faith. You didn't keep going down the negative road of thinking that it's one thing. And I think that God has a purpose for you, just like he does me and anybody listening to the show too. I know I got hit up recently by somebody saying they hate hearing me preach on this show, and I didn't even respond because I'm going to keep preaching on the show. So
I was going to say, I hope that's not the case, because I preached a little bit on your show. I wouldn't have known that was off limits. Yeah. And, I really appreciate hearing that. So there are times, so I think my faith, I took it for granted. I thought I had this really strong faith and nothing could ever move my faith. And believe me, I've been through hell, in different ways throughout my life in normal, regular 3D ways. And I thought it was unshakable, but it was almost like I had to earn it. It was almost like it was handed to me. I was a kid. And then, then I was like, oh, no, 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 that's way too easy. You're going to have to kind of go through hell yourself. And when it comes to this alien abduction phenomenon, there's 85% of abductees will look back on what happened to them and turn it into something positive. So either nothing extremely negative happened to them. By the way, the more cooperative you are, the more it's just about business. And that's just kind of a general statement. It's not always true. But the more cooperative you are, you're in your zombie mode, you go through your business. And don't get me wrong, that business is horrific. But you might not get a lot of pushback during the abduction. So I do think that if it weren't for the extremely negative things that happened to me, unambiguously negative, and I still haven't talked about it on any podcast yet. I thought today might be the day. If it weren't for those things, and if it weren't for the way things happen with me, I might be part of the 85%. I might have just washed it all away and said, oh, they're just trying to upgrade our consciousness. They're just trying to make us better. This is for the good of humankind. I just need to participate in that. I might be the 85% if it weren't for those things. So I throw that out there too.
That's good. And lastly, before we get out of here, and I've talked about this before, but I have a little reading material for the people listening to the show today, because they're always asking me what I read, what I do. And this isn't necessarily research material. However, it's for your soul research, if that makes sense. And I believe in downloading. And I did a show last December with Isaac Weishaupt, and we talked about Enochian downloads and just how it's worked from ancient alchemists all the way to now. And we talked about the modern UFO movement. But one of the things I talked about at the end of the show was that downloading also works when it comes to being Christian. We get the download from the Holy Spirit. We get the download from Yahweh. We get the download from Jesus. We get the download from the Trinity. We get the download from God. And I totally believe in that if we know how to open ourselves up to God. And I think that really what the enemy's done is just create the inversion of the perfect way of receiving the download. I talk to Tony about this all the time. He and I talk about downloading. He said I'm turning Pentecostal because I talk about downloads so much. But I've read a book, and it is absolutely fascinating about how to do that. It's by Martin Layard, and he wrote a book called Into the Silent Land. And I'm going to put it up here for people to see as well. This is the book here. And it's about contemplative meditation to God. So it's not opening up your chakras or anything new age. This is just how the desert fathers did, how people throughout history that learned how to quiet themselves enough to where they shut out all the noise and were able to receive the download from God, were able to receive the path that God wants us to go on. It plays right into Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. So that is the entire basis of that book. And it has honestly just been revolutionary for me. I mean, it has changed my whole outlook on how I think about life, how I think about other people, how I'm able to learn quiet contemplation to where I literally do nothing but just commune with God. And I'm not even talking about talking to him like prayers. We're just talking about literally opening yourself up to God and allowing him to implement what he wants to in you. And it's understanding that he's already in you, but being able to unlock that. And I find that book absolutely one of my top books all time. I'm actually about to reread it, and I'm encouraging anybody that's listening to the show to read it. It's helped me in my spiritual walk a ton, and I hope it helps you too. And if you don't read it, that's cool too. Maybe you have your own way of connecting to God, but I just wanted to throw that out there before we get out of here today.
Yeah, I'll check it out. Just very quickly, while I was going through this, it was a spiritual crisis that I went through. During the whole time, I continued to pray. I would actually say, "Don't let me go." And I was getting downloads, and I still always question where they come from, but I felt like a ping pong ball. Like I would be led away from, I'll just say Christianity in general,
Mm-hmm.
and then I would get a download that would
Mm,
fully explain everything about Jesus. I mean, you could see in my
mm.
journal, well, I've written, oh no, it's actually Jesus. And I'm just writing, and it's all about Christ. So it's definitely a thing. These downloads are not only coming from the negative aliens, but it's the discernment that goes a long way. Trying to figure out these messages, where they're coming from. What are they saying? What's the motive? So yeah, I'll definitely check that book out. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate you coming on the show today. And it ended up being an absolute banger. And I know you weren't expecting that initially, but you killed it. And everything you had to say fit in perfectly with what I'd been researching. And for anyone that knows, I don't go out really looking for guests a lot of times. The guests just kind of find their way to what I think while I'm researching. So a lot of times I'm researching something and I'm like, I know they'll be good for this. Let me reach out and see if they'd be willing to get on. So I'm really happy you jumped on this podcast today. It's going to be an awesome episode for people to hear. You've got a lot of great insight when it comes to this type of stuff. And I think more people need to hear that because one, they're seeing someone who's actively going through it, but also has a very strong level of faith. I'm sure you feel weak at times, and we all do, but at the end of the day,
It's bad, trust me.
right. But at the end of the day, you are pushing forward. And I do feel like that there'll be a breakthrough for you, but there's a reason why you're going through it right now. And I think God has a purpose for that. And I think he has a purpose for all of us. And, I talk to Tony all the time, why are we shooting these films, hunting these weird things down? Well, there's a reason for that. We're doing that on purpose because there is a huge contingent of people out there shooting the same type of films, but are also spinning it the way the enemy wants to spend it. And I feel like that there needs to be another narrative that's put out there that's able to show kind of what's going on behind the scenes in the spiritual realm when it comes to God, when it comes to Satan, when it comes to all these different entities. And I feel like that we're all being called in our own ways to do that. And, I really appreciate you coming on the show and telling people that. And if you can, let everybody know where they can find you. And I know you do I believe you do some X Spaces sometimes as well. And I know you do stuff on there a lot. So let everybody know about that too.
So you can find me at fringe.com on X. That's basically where I'm at. I'm actually on Tony's platform as well, but I'm not quite as active over there. And I want to thank you, Joel, and Tony, and everybody else who's doing this work. It is so important to get the word out, and to get the word out to Christians. That's what's important, because we can be lost. And that's a whole other thing, a whole Calvinist thing, that you can't be lost, but I think we can be lost. And I think that's exactly what they want.
I really appreciate you coming on again, Fringe. And for everybody, check out my song, Plato's Cave. It's playing at the end of this episode. And you know what we do, guys. Go outside, touch grass, and get your tail out the hole.
I'm feeling what shocks us does the sin. We just love what's toxic and we binge. Think we're free when we're on the fringe. But we're lost, yeah, we're lost, yeah, we're lost. Ropes full of death and bones. For all we leave when we chase the most. What we acquire will decompose. What do we want, do we want, do we want? Shadows dance on the cave from our masters. Fires closing in behind us, it don't matter. Puppets dancing to the flicker, hear the laughter. And we just think that it's normal in the past. Become our names. garden while his friends slept. We're just broken pieces to the gold and no missteps. I'm here to break down all your idols, ritualistic. If you don't like it, I don't speak in euphemistic terms. The world is run by Charles Montgomery Burns. They keeping it hooded like CERN. They've done it in thirds before the earth was occurred. And all the friction I'm getting is warranted when your chambers don't echo. The insurance needed for what I be saying don't come from progressive or geckos. And why you popping Prosecco if you ain't putting in labor? I'm taking shots of espresso. Every second I favor more than the last. We never get a return on time lost with the divine laws, but people looking to wrap it like tacos with lime sauce. Hey, I never cared too much what they saying. Matter of fact, what I'm saying, I ain't here to explain it on the levels. All they see, but they don't see my creator campaign of politicians for your souls. No debating, but softer than eggs, I'm calling on Benedict Arnold. I got me a chopper. Most of our collars are blue. Most of us can't even afford one. Lining up for new iPhones and Jordans. It ain't our blessings and we praying for misfortunes. On others on our socials feeling so important. I'm breaking you down. Ain't here to make you feel comfortable. Just avowing the opposite sex while creating the monsters that's haunting us. These hells we create for ourselves. Timelines are nothing but cells. Shadows dance in the cave from our masters. Fires closing in behind us, it don't matter. What was dancing